The first time my father publicly called me a burden, I was 7 years old and standing in the cereal aisle at a grocery store holding a box of marshmallow cereal I hadn't even asked for. I still remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while he laughed quietly to the cashier and said, "Claire always wants things she doesn't deserve." The cashier smiled awkwardly. My mother looked away, and my little sister Sophia stood there clutching two candy bars my father had already bought for her without question. Strange how your life can split open in tiny moments like that. You don't realize it at the time. You just carry the feeling forward like a stone in your chest until one day you wake up and realize the stone became your personality. If you've ever been the child in your family who felt invisible, no matter how hard you tried, you'll probably understand exactly what I mean. And if you do, stay with me because what happened to me 3 weeks ago at my sister's engagement party still doesn't feel real even now. Growing up in our house in Fairfield, Connecticut felt like living inside a carefully managed performance where Sophia was always the lead actress and I was just part of the background set design. Sophia had my mother's bright blonde hair, effortless smile, and this strange ability to make every room revolve around her without even trying. Teachers loved her. Neighbors adored her. Relatives called her special before she even graduated middle school. Meanwhile, I learned very early that the easiest way to survive in our family was to need as little as possible. My father, Robert Bennett, respected one thing above everything else: people who made him look successful. Sophia did that naturally. I didn't. I was quieter, more observant, the kind of kid who noticed things adults wish children wouldn't notice. Like how my mother's smile disappeared whenever she looked at me too long, or how family photos somehow always placed me near the edge like an afterthought accidentally left inside the frame. At 13, I stopped asking for birthday parties after overhearing my father complain that I wasn't worth wasting money on. He didn't know I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen when he said it. My mother didn't argue with him either. She just softly said, "Sophia has more potential. Claire's different." Different. That word followed me for years like a shadow. Different meant less lovable, less important, less worthy of investment. And eventually, after hearing something long enough, you start shaping yourself around it. By 16, I had straight A's, a part-time job at a bookstore, and enough anxiety to make my hands shake before dinner every night. Not because anyone yelled. Honestly, yelling would have been easier. Silence was worse in our house. Silence made you feel erased. Then one night, everything changed. Because I accidentally overheard a conversation between my parents that I was never supposed to hear, and what my father said next made my entire body go cold. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water when I heard my father say my name in the kitchen. Not loudly. That was the thing about my father. The most damaging things he ever said were always calm, controlled. Like he had rehearsed them long before speaking them out loud. I stopped halfway down the staircase when I heard him sigh heavily and say, "We should have stopped pretending years ago." My mother answered in a lower voice I could barely hear. "Robert." "She keeps looking at me like she expects something," he continued. "Love, approval, I don't know, but every time I look at her, all I see is a mistake that cost us everything." My fingers tightened around the railing so hard my knuckles hurt. A mistake. I remember staring at the framed family photos hanging beside the staircase while my heartbeat started pounding in my ears. There were dozens of pictures of Sophia smiling in dance costumes, Sophia holding trophies, Sophia sitting between my parents on vacations I barely remembered attending. In every photo with me, I looked slightly out of place, like someone added afterward with poor editing. My mother said something then, so quietly I almost missed it. "She can't know the truth." Silence followed. Not shock silence. The kind of silence that told me they had circled this conversation many times before. Then my father spoke again, softer this time. "If Eleanor says anything at the engagement party, we're finished." My stomach dropped so suddenly I had to sit down on the stairs before my legs gave out beneath me. "Eleanor." My grandmother. Until that moment, I had never connected her strange behavior over the years. The way she sometimes stared at me too long during family dinners. The birthday cards she mailed me separately with handwritten notes saying things like, "Never let other people define your worth." The way my father's jaw tightened whenever she asked me questions about school or work. Looking back now, the signs had always been there. I just never understood what they meant. A cabinet door slammed downstairs, making me flinch. "She already suspects something," my mother whispered sharply. "Claire notices everything." "Then maybe it's time she learned her place," my father replied. His voice had gone cold again. "After the engagement party, none of this will matter anyway." I barely slept that night, every sentence replayed in my head over and over like a scratched record. A mistake that cost us everything. She can't know the truth. If Eleanor says anything, we're finished. By morning, I convinced myself I had misunderstood. I wanted to believe that, desperately, because the alternative felt too large, too ugly to even name out loud. But 3 days later, my grandmother called me unexpectedly and asked me to meet her alone at a small cafe near the marina. And the first thing she said when I sat down across from her was, "Claire, your parents have lied to you your entire life." The cafe overlooked the harbor, all gray water and drifting fog, the kind of place people went to have quiet conversations they did not want overheard. My grandmother Eleanor sat near the window wearing a cream-colored coat and leather gloves even though it was barely cold outside. There was a cup of untouched tea in front of her. I remember noticing that first because my grandmother always drank her tea immediately, before it had time to cool. That morning, she looked nervous enough to forget it existed. When I sat down across from her, she reached for my hand so quickly it startled me. "Claire," she said softly, her eyes already shining with emotion. "Before I tell you anything else, you need to understand something very clearly. None of what happened to you was your fault." My chest tightened instantly. People only say things like that when they are about to destroy the version of your life you have spent years trying to survive. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the marina. Inside, silverware clinked softly against ceramic plates, while two businessmen laughed near the counter like the world had not just tilted sideways beneath my feet. I stared at her without speaking. My grandmother inhaled slowly, glancing toward the window before lowering her voice. "Your father has spent 27 years trying to erase a debt he could never repay." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" She opened her purse carefully and slid a folded document across the table toward me, but kept one hand resting on top of it as if she was not ready to let go yet. "Your parents were drowning before you were born," she said. "Financially, emotionally. Their marriage was already collapsing. Robert's business failed 6 months before your mother became pregnant with you." I blinked, confused. None of that matched the stories I grew up hearing. My father always talked about our family like we came from stability, discipline, success. Failure was something he accused other people of. Never himself. Then Sophia was born, Eleanor continued quietly. And suddenly your father believed he had a second chance at building the perfect family image he always wanted. The way she said it made something cold move through me. "What about me?" I asked. My grandmother's eyes lowered for just a second. "You came later than expected." Later than expected. Such a strange phrase. Like I was a scheduling error instead of a person. I felt my throat tighten, but she still had not removed her hand from the folded paper between us. "Claire," she whispered, "your father blamed you for something that was never your fault." My heartbeat started pounding harder. Blamed me for what? For the first time since I arrived, my grandmother looked genuinely afraid. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her hand away from the document. I stared down at the old hospital paperwork beneath it and saw my own name typed across the top beside 3 words that made my entire body go numb. Maternal emergency transfer. I stared at the document for so long the words stopped looking real. The paper itself looked old, slightly yellowed around the edges, the kind of hospital form nobody keeps unless they are trying to remember something they cannot survive forgetting. My name sat there beside my mother's in faded black ink. Maternal emergency transfer. High-risk delivery. Cardiac instability. I swallowed hard and looked back up at my grandmother. "What is this?" My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. Eleanor folded her trembling hands together on the table. "When your mother was pregnant with you, there were complications," she said carefully. "Severe ones. The doctors warned your father there was a possibility she would not survive the delivery." I felt something cold spread through my chest. "But she did survive." "Yes," Eleanor whispered, "but your father never forgave you for the fact that she almost did not." Outside, rain had started tapping softly against the cafe windows, turning the harbor gray and blurry. People passed by carrying umbrellas and coffee cups, while my entire childhood rearranged itself into something darker and far more fragile than I ever imagined. Suddenly, all those years made horrible sense. My father's distance, my mother's guilt, the way nobody in the family ever spoke about my birth except in vague half-sentences that always ended too quickly. I leaned back slowly, trying to breathe through the pressure building behind my ribs. "That is insane," I said quietly. "I was a baby." "I know." My grandmother's eyes filled instantly. "Claire, I know." But there was something else in her expression too. Fear. Not just sadness, real fear. "Your father built an entire version of reality around blaming you," she continued, "and over time your mother stopped correcting him because it became easier than facing what was happening." I thought about my mother standing quietly beside him all those years. Never cruel enough to be obvious, never kind enough to stop it, just existing somewhere in the middle like a person trapped underwater too long to remember what air felt like. "Sophia knows, doesn't she?" I asked suddenly. My grandmother hesitated. That hesitation was enough. A sharp ache moved through me so quickly I almost laughed. Of course she knew. The golden child always knows more than everyone thinks. "Not everything," Eleanor admitted softly, "but enough." I looked down at the hospital document again. My hands were shaking now. "So what exactly are you trying to tell me?" My grandmother opened her mouth, then stopped. Her eyes drifted toward the front window of the cafe. I turned instinctively and saw my father standing across the street in the rain beside a black sedan, staring directly at us through the glass. He was not moving. He was just watching. And when our eyes met, his expression changed in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, panic. For a moment, neither of us moved. Rain slid slowly down the cafe window between my father and me, warping his reflection like water over cracked glass. He looked older standing there than he had that morning, smaller somehow. But it was the panic in his face that unsettled me most because my father did not panic. Robert Bennett controlled rooms, controlled conversations, controlled narratives. That was what he had always done. Yet now, staring through the rain at the folder sitting in front of me, he looked like a man watching his entire life drift toward the edge of a cliff. "Claire," my grandmother said carefully, her voice tight with warning, "do not speak to him until I finish explaining everything." But I was already standing. I do not even remember making the decision. One second I was frozen in my chair, the next I was pushing through the cafe door into the cold rain while Eleanor called my name behind me. My father straightened immediately as I approached him. "Get in the car," he said quietly. No greeting, no concern, just control. The same tone he used my entire childhood whenever he wanted obedience without discussion. I stopped a few feet away instead. Rain soaked through my coat collar while traffic hissed along the wet street behind us. "Why were you watching us?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Because your grandmother has a habit of turning private family matters into disasters." "Private?" I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You spent my entire life making me feel unwanted, and now suddenly it is private?" He looked away for half a second, toward the harbor, before speaking again. "You don't understand the pressure your mother and I were under back then. I was a child. My voice cracked harder than I wanted it to. You blamed a child. For the first time in my life, my father looked genuinely exhausted. Water dripped from his hair onto the shoulders of his dark coat, while people hurried past us under umbrellas, pretending not to stare. Your mother almost died, he said quietly. Everything changed after that. So you punished me for existing? He flinched slightly at that word. Existing. It landed harder than I expected. Then he said something that stopped me cold. I tried not to. The rain suddenly felt heavier around us. My father rubbed a hand across his face, like a man struggling to hold together pieces that no longer fit. You think Sophia was loved more because she was special, he said. But that is not the truth. I stared at him, confused. Then what is the truth? His eyes lifted back to mine, and for the first time since I could remember, there was no arrogance in them, only fear. The truth, he said slowly, is that Sophia was never supposed to know what your mother did to save this family after you were born. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Before he could answer, the cafe door slammed open behind us. My grandmother rushed outside into the rain, clutching the folder against her chest. Her face had gone completely pale. Robert, she said, almost breathless. She already knows. My father turned toward her instantly. What? Eleanor looked directly at me, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. Claire, she whispered, I didn't give the documents to Sophia because I trusted her more than you. I gave them to her because she called me last night crying. I stared at her. She said she couldn't go through with the engagement party because something about this family felt wrong. She said she had spent her whole life being loved while watching you disappear inside this family, and she couldn't explain why. She begged me to tell her the truth. My grandmother's voice trembled. I thought she deserved an answer. I never imagined she would read everything and leave. She swallowed hard. She found the original trust papers, the bank records, and your grandfather's letters. Then she disappeared this morning. Everything after that felt both impossibly fast and unbearably slow. My father immediately grabbed his phone and stepped away from us under the awning beside the cafe, dialing Sophia over and over while rain hammered the sidewalk hard enough to blur the streetlights. No answer. Straight to voicemail every time. My grandmother stood beside me, trembling slightly, clutching the folder so tightly the edges bent beneath her fingers. When did she leave? My father demanded sharply. Eleanor looked shaken. Early this morning, her fiancé called me an hour ago asking if I had heard from her. She left her apartment sometime during the night. I watched my father's composure crack further with every unanswered call. It was strange seeing him like this. My entire life, he had been the person everyone else adjusted around. Even his silence carried authority. But now his hands shook as he lowered the phone from his ear. What exactly did she find? I asked quietly. Neither of them answered immediately. That silence felt heavier than anything else. Finally, my grandmother slowly opened the folder again. Inside were documents layered together in careful order. Hospital reports, insurance statements, legal forms, old bank records. Some of them looked so worn they had probably been handled hundreds of times over the years. After your mother's medical emergency, Eleanor said carefully, your father's business collapsed completely. They were facing bankruptcy within months. You already told me that. No, she whispered. I only told you the beginning. My father closed his eyes briefly like a man bracing for impact. Eleanor, she deserves the truth. Her voice sharpened unexpectedly. God knows she deserved it years ago. I stared between them while cold rainwater dripped from the edge of the awning beside us. Cars rolled past slowly on the slick street, headlights reflecting silver across puddles. Everything around us looked painfully ordinary, while my entire life kept splitting open piece by piece. My grandmother pulled one document free from the folder and handed it to me carefully. It was an old property transfer agreement dated 26 years earlier. My eyes scanned the names before confusion hit me. My mother's name, my grandfather's signature, and beneath it, the deed to Eleanor's lake house in Vermont. "What is this?" I asked. My father looked away instantly. Eleanor answered instead. "Your mother sold everything she inherited from our family to keep your father out of prison after his financial fraud investigation." My breath caught. "What?" "It was never made public," she continued quietly. "The investigation ended after a private restitution agreement was reached. Your mother sacrificed every dollar she had to protect him." I looked at my father in disbelief. The same man who spent my childhood acting morally superior to everyone around him had nearly destroyed our family before I was even old enough to speak. "And somehow that became my fault?" I asked. His face tightened with shame, so visible it almost startled me. "He needed someone to blame," Eleanor said softly. "And every time he looked at you, he remembered what your mother lost to save him." My father finally spoke again, but his voice sounded hollow now. "That is not the whole story." A knot tightened instantly in my stomach. "What else is there?" He looked directly at me then, rain dripping from his jawline, his expression unreadable. Sophia was not supposed to find out who actually paid the final settlement. Before I could respond, his phone suddenly rang in his hand. All three of us froze when we saw Sophia's name lighting up the screen. My father stared at the phone like it was something dangerous before he finally answered. "Sophia?" His voice cracked on her name, and for some reason that scared me more than his anger ever had. Rain tapped lightly against the awning above us, while my grandmother stood frozen beside me, one hand pressed to her mouth. For a few seconds, all I could hear was Sophia breathing on the other end. Then she said, "You lied to me too." My father closed his eyes. "Sophia, where are you?" "That's not what matters right now," she said, and her voice sounded nothing like the confident, polished sister I had grown up watching glide through every room. She sounded small, shaken. "I found the copies Grandma sent me. The bank records, the trust paperwork, all of it." My stomach tightened. "What trust?" I asked, but nobody answered me. My father's face had gone gray. Sophia heard me anyway. "Claire," she whispered, and for the first time in my life, my sister sounded afraid to speak to me. "Grandpa created a trust for you when you were born. Dad was named temporary trustee because you were a minor. He wasn't supposed to spend the money. He was only supposed to manage it." I looked at my grandmother. Tears were already sliding down her face. My father shook his head once, almost violently. "It wasn't that simple." Sophia let out a broken laugh. "The records show you borrowed against the trust after the fraud investigation and kept delaying repayment until so much time had passed that nobody talked about it anymore. The world seemed to narrow around me. You used my inheritance," I said quietly. My father looked at me then, and the panic in his eyes finally made sense. It was not fear of being misunderstood, it was fear of being seen clearly. "I always thought I'd put it back." The words sounded pathetic even to him. "You didn't just take money," Sophia said quietly. "You took her future and then spent 27 years convincing her she never deserved one." Silence followed. Then Sophia started crying. "I knew they treated you differently," she said to me. "I knew something was wrong, but I told myself Mom was right when she said you were stronger than me. I'm sorry, Claire. I should have asked more questions." I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted the truth to feel like justice. But standing there in the wet street, hearing my sister fall apart and watching my father shrink under the weight of his own choices, I felt something much heavier than victory. I felt the final piece of my childhood click into place. My father had not hated me because I was difficult. He had hated what I represented, the money he stole, the crime my mother covered, the shame he never had the courage to carry himself. And for 27 years he had made me carry it for him. The rain finally began to slow, but the air around us still felt heavy enough to drown in. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after Sophia's words. Cars continued moving through the intersection nearby, windshield wipers sweeping back and forth in quiet rhythm, while my entire understanding of my family sat shattered at my feet like broken glass. Nobody knew how to clean up. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. Not powerful, not intimidating, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying the same lie so long, it starts carrying you instead. Claire, he said finally, his voice rough, I was going to tell you someday. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. 27 years of coldness, 27 years of being treated like an unwanted reminder sitting in the corner of every family photo. And somehow he still thought this was a story about timing instead of damage. Someday? I repeated quietly. You watched me work 3 jobs in college because you said there was no money. My throat tightened harder with every word. You let me believe I was worth less than everyone else in this family because it was easier than admitting what you did. My father lowered his eyes. He did not defend himself this time. That hurt more than if he had. My grandmother stood silently beside us. One hand pressed against her chest as if she could physically hold herself together that way. Over the phone, Sophia had stopped crying. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded smaller somehow. Less polished, less certain. Claire, she whispered. I did not know all of it. I closed my eyes briefly. Growing up, Sophia had always moved through life like sunlight naturally followed her. Doors opened for her, people softened around her. Even her mistakes somehow became charming stories everyone laughed about later. Meanwhile, I spent years learning how to shrink myself small enough not to inconvenience anyone. But hearing her cry now did not feel satisfying the way I once imagined it would. It just felt sad. Did you ever wonder why they treated us so differently? I asked quietly. There was a long silence before she answered. Sometimes. Her voice cracked. But whenever I asked Mom about it, she would say you were independent and stronger than me. I wanted to believe that. Stronger. Another word people use when they want to justify leaving someone alone. My father leaned heavily against the side of the car, rainwater dripping from the edge of his coat onto the pavement. Your mother begged me to tell you the truth years ago, he admitted quietly. But the longer I waited, the harder it became. I looked at him then, really looked at him. For the first time in my life, I saw not just my father, but a man built entirely out of shame and avoidance. A man who spent decades punishing his daughter because every time he saw her, he saw proof of his own failure. And somehow that realization hurt worse than the hatred ever did. Then my grandmother gently touched my arm and handed me one final document from the folder. There is one more thing you need to know, she said softly. I looked down at the paper in my hands and felt my breath catch instantly when I recognized my grandfather's signature beneath a sentence written entirely in his handwriting. Everything belongs to Claire when she is ready to know why. The rain stopped completely about 20 minutes later, leaving the streets shining beneath the harbor lights like everything had been washed clean except us. We ended up back inside the cafe because nobody seemed to know where else to go. My grandmother sat quietly near the window with both hands wrapped around a fresh cup of tea she still was not drinking. My father looked exhausted in a way I had never thought possible. The sharp edges that defined him my entire life seemed gone now, worn down by truth finally catching up to him. I sat across from the handwritten note my grandfather left behind and read it 3 times before the words fully settled inside me. Everything belongs to Claire when she is ready to know why. Beneath it was another sentence written smaller, almost as if he added it afterward. Some people spend their whole lives being blamed for wounds they never created. I felt tears burn behind my eyes for the first time that day. Not because of the money, not because of the betrayal, but because somebody had seen me all along. Somebody knew. My father stared down at the table for a long time before finally speaking. Your grandfather hated me after what happened, he admitted quietly. He said I was turning my shame into your burden. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Burden. Funny how one word can follow you through an entire life like an echo in an empty house. Why did you stay? I asked him softly. Why spend years pretending to love me if every time you looked at me you saw failure? He swallowed hard before answering. Because part of me did love you. The honesty in that hurt worse than a lie would have. But another part of me could not survive what your mother sacrificed for me. And every time you succeeded, despite everything I did, it reminded me what kind of man I had become. Across the table, my grandmother quietly wiped tears from her cheeks, while outside the clouds slowly drifted apart above the harbor. My phone buzzed then. A text from Sophia. I am sorry for all of it. That weekend, we still held the engagement dinner. I almost didn't go. Then Sophia called and asked me to come. The room looked exactly the way I imagined it would have looked before my life fell apart. Soft lights, flowers, relatives laughing over wine glasses. People who had known me for years without ever really knowing me. Halfway through dinner, Sophia stood up. She looked nervous, then she picked up her glass. I need to say something before this engagement moves forward, she said. The room slowly quieted. She looked directly at me. When I was growing up, I thought my sister was stronger than me. That's what I was always told. I thought she didn't need as much love, as much help, or as much protection. Her voice shook. I know now that wasn't true. It was just easier for the adults in this family to believe she needed less, because they had already decided to give her less. The room went completely silent. My father lowered his eyes. My mother began crying quietly. Sophia swallowed hard. My sister spent 27 years apologizing for a debt that was never hers. She carried shame that belonged to other people, because nobody had the courage to carry it themselves. She reached into her purse. Then she walked across the room and handed me my grandfather's handwritten note. Everything belongs to Claire when she is ready to know why. I looked up at her. For the first time in my life, my sister looked at me not like the quiet background character in our family story, but like someone she had finally learned to see. Nobody applauded, nobody spoke. The silence itself felt like an apology. A few weeks later, I returned to Vermont alone to see the old lake house my mother lost all those years ago. The porch still creaked the same way it did when I was little. Pine trees swayed softly beside the water while cold autumn wind moved across the lake in slow silver ripples. Standing there, I realized something that changed me more than any document ever could. My worth had never depended on whether my parents were capable of seeing it. Some people grow up loved openly. Others grow up learning how to survive silence. And if anyone listening to this has ever spent years feeling invisible inside their own family, wondering why love seemed easier for everyone else to receive, I hope you understand this before I did. The way people fail you often says far more about their wounds than your value.